He is the author of The Greeks on Global History, which is also the title of this episode. Please welcome Roderick Beaton. And before we start, I want to say that this is going to be a two-part history, because like his book, we're going to talk from 1500 BCE until today, 2023. And because it's such a huge topic, we're going to cover 1500 years each episode. So first, and we're going to end this episode by the time of Constantine, and next week we're going to pick up from Constantine until today. And we got quite a lot to go through, but first I was open with, how did you get so fascinated by the Greeks?
Well, thank you very much for having me on your podcast. It's a great pleasure to meet and to talk to you and your audience about my book. I've been fascinated by the Greeks ever since I was a teenager. I must have been 13 or 14 when I first had the opportunity with my family to go to Greece as a simple, impressionable British tourist. But I also had the good fortune at the very same time to begin learning ancient Greek as an optional extra class at school. And there weren't very many people in the class. It was an unusual choice to make, but I loved it. It was my favorite lesson. And I think really right from that very first impression, I'd been left ever since with that double experience of an ancient language that's very difficult but very challenging and that I loved learning, and actually seeing the place, hearing the people. There was a lot of touristic sea and sunshine mixed up with that, but it was just the wonderful liveliness of Greece as I experienced it, coupled with the language that was 3,000 years old. And I just thought this was fantastic. I've stayed with it ever since.
Right. Let's begin with the year 1500 BC, because that's where most, I believe, historians start to consider this beginning of ancient Greece history. But we don't have a lot, from what I recall, we don't have a lot to go on before 1500. Is that when we started to see that's the time of Homer, right? The beginning of Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad, right? So is that around the time when writing started coming into the Greek world? Is that why we have so little before 15 BC?
No, well, that's a very interesting question. And actually, there are lots of different possible starting points. And, some histories of ancient Greece start later. Others go back much further, because obviously there were civilizations, there were people, there were palaces, there are archaeological remains in Greece, which go back thousands of years before 1500 BC. But I took the starting point, but it's basically the point of reference throughout the whole book, the Greek language. Now, throughout the many millennia of what we call prehistory, that is human experience before there were written records, we know that people lived in Greece, in the area of today's Greece. We don't know for certain what language they spoke, and we can only learn about them through their physical remains, through archaeology, through digging up burials and graves and so on.
But that can only take you so far, though.
It only takes you so far. And I wanted to start with the first people that we know spoke a form of the same language that's still spoken today. And that takes you back to the actual written records are dated nowadays. There's been a lot of argument about this, but they're probably dated to 1400 BCE. And I take it just a little bit further back, because obviously in order to be writing the records in that language, the people must have been speaking it for at least 100 years before that. I took a round number, and I also took an event that at the time must have been quite recent, but which had a literally seismic effect on the whole region where these Greek speakers lived. And that was the explosive eruption of the volcano that we know today as Santorini or Thera in the middle of the Aegean Sea. And we know that that caused untold devastation. People must have thought it was a visitation of the gods, that the world was ending. And that had happened probably about 1540, 1550. So I wanted to start the book about 1500, where you've got a bunch of, quite a small bunch probably, of people who speak this language in the southern part of today's Greece, perhaps on some of the Aegean islands. And let's just tell the story. Let's look at what they were doing then and what they went on to do after that. That's how it starts.
So let's begin with Homer, because he's obviously one of the most famous writers, and I do believe, if I recall correctly, you do begin with him as well. And there is this, of course, this discussion if that it was one person, or if it's written kind of like folk tales. Do you think that that's kind of the case? Do you think there was one person called Homer that is kind of a later synonym for the Iliad and the
Well, the
Odyssey?
truth, yeah, I mean, the truth is that nobody knows if there ever really was a single person called Homer. Um, I think probably most specialists, most scholars today take the view that the poems, the enormously long and marvelous narrative poems, the epics that we know as the Iliad and the Odyssey, probably had been taking shape over hundreds of years before the time when they were first written down. And people don't even agree now about when that was. It could have been around about 800 BC, when the alphabet that we still use was invented for the first time. It could have been a couple of hundred years even after that. But it's pretty likely that these stories were being told, we're almost certain, these stories about heroes and about a great war between Greeks and the city of Troy, they've been being told for centuries before the poet came along. And one of the great sort of literary historical puzzles is, was it an actual accumulation? If there was a person called Homer, did he just write down what he heard that other people had made up before him? Or was there a genius who gathered together lots of scattered different stories that different people told him at different times? And this single person had the idea of writing down one long narrative. We just don't know how that happened. What we do know is that these two great long poems are the first works of literature, of poetry, narrative, that have existed. They've constantly been written, they were being recopied and read aloud and commented on and imitated and discussed in every generation from that time to this. So that literally what we now call world literature begins with the poems attributed to Homer.
And now we'd rather come back to Alexander later, of course, and refer to Alexander the Great. There's a legend that says that he slept with the Iliad and the Odyssey under his pillow every night. There's this legend, but what kind of form? And I saw this question on Reddit of all places, but what kind of form? And it kind of got me thinking, what kind of form would the Iliad look like that? Then it was it a stone tablet? Was it a papyrus that Alexander allegedly had slept on every night?
Yeah, a good point. I mean, we tend to, we think of a book as being the kind of book that we're talking about, but of course, books like that didn't exist in those days. No, what it would have been one, or more likely several, rolls of papyrus. The papyrus reeds that grow in Egypt along the Nile were sort of mashed up and flattened and made into long rolls of paper. And people wrote in columns along those rolls, and then they put them on a kind of spindle and sort of rolled it up, a bit like rolling a cigarette, but very much longer, obviously. And then as you read, you would kind of unwind the spindle. It was like spooling through an old a cinema film. Let's say, I don't think there's not exactly a digital equivalent that I can think of.
Right.
But yes, it would have been something. It would have been something like that, a papyrus roll.
So let's begin with forming of cities. When did these civilizations start to form place in ancient Greece, like Athens, later Sparta, and other cities among the line of what in today known as Greece?
Well, this seems to have happened over a long period of time. And it's a time that we don't really know much about, because there 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 weren't there wasn't very much being written down at the time until the alphabet was invented. By the time the alphabet was invented, we find communities on traveling on ships all around what we think of as the Greek islands, but also much further afield. Greeks got on ships and they went right round the Mediterranean, through the straits into the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov in today's Ukraine and southern Russia, northern Turkey, and wherever they went, they sort of parked their ship on the shore. They built what they called a city. It was quite a small community, and they found a way of, obviously, they must have found some way of working with the people who already lived there. They mostly didn't fight with them to begin with anyway. They just settled in these cities. And that meant that you had lots and lots of these little groups of people setting up the hundreds of cities. And they were on their own. They'd no single leader to tell them how to do it. They'd no religion. I mean, they had a religion, but they didn't have a kind of religious revelation such as Christianity or Islam offers. So the gods weren't really there to tell them how to do it either. They consulted oracles and they argued about what the gods really meant. But basically, the Greeks of those early days, these early centuries, had to work it out for themselves. And in doing that, they invented the beginning of what we today call politics. The word politics comes from the Greek word for a city-state, which is polis. And politics just means how you run your city-state.
So let's talk about the forming of politics and eventually, especially in Athens, of course, the forming of democracy. What was in the early? Do you have an idea what the early hierarchies in these civilizations, such as Athens, Sparta, etc., when the aristocracy kind of start taking form in these cities?
Yes, and in some ways, I mean, they were surprisingly modern because when we first hear about what's going on in these cities, it is very political. It's about class, it's about wealth, it's about inequality. And in city after city, we read about the landowning, wealthy classes, the people who can afford horses and expensive armor, and they're kind of at loggerheads with the ordinary people. The phrase hoi polloi, meaning the rather dismissive phrase for everybody else, is actually a Greek word meaning the many. So you've got this kind of face-off between the many and the few. And in many of these city-states also, you would get a phenomenon that we're all too familiar with in recent years, where a single strongman seizes power and basically bribes and bullies his way to impose his will on all the other citizens. So really, city-states fall into three different kinds. There's what they call tyrannies, and a tyrant is actually just a strongman. I mean, someone like today's Putin is the obvious example.
Right. It didn't necessarily mean that you were just like you said, a bad guy in the beginning, a tyrant.
That's right.
Wasn't Persilis, I believe, a tyrant as well, considered, if I remember correctly?
Which one, sorry?
Persilis, if I say his name right, I believe.
Not sure I got that one, but don't worry.
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, tyrants were not necessarily tyrannical, but ancient Greek philosophers basically hated the idea of the single strong man. So what they called tyranny, they regarded as something that was very bad. Very common also, again, the word still exists, was oligarchy. That is, you've got the wealthy citizens band together, they keep out the rest, they make the rules, but it's still a collective decision making. And then out of the mix of and the competition between the social classes, the haves and the have-nots, you also get in Athens at the end of the 6th century BC, you get the first beginning of what came to be called demokratia, that is democracy. And this was the idea that actually the whole mass of the citizenry collectively make the decisions. It's literally people's rule. And that emerged around about the year, or shortly around before the year 500. And it really took off for several hundred years in many of the Greek city-states after that. It was never easy. It was constantly in competition with oligarchs or with tyrants, and eventually it was rolled up. It was rolled up by mighty kings and emperors, but it lasted for hundreds of years, and it laid the foundations for the democratic systems that we know today.
There was another superpower, maybe not superpower. That's kind of a strong word, but there was another power, and I will mostly refer to these two cities because those are the well-known cities in ancient Greece. Of course, I'm never referring to Sparta. So when did Sparta become a major rival, and when did Spartan civilization started to thrive and kind of compete with Athens?
During the 6th century and the 5th century, they actually, at the end of the 5th century, they actually fought for 27 years, a bitter war between them, and they marshaled all the other city-states into alliances against each other. It was a tragic waste that so much of this civilization had invented so many things that we still value and treasure today. They were never really found a way of living with each other. The Greeks were brilliant at inventing politics and finding political systems that worked within quite small states, the city-states.
Right.
But they never got it together to create the equivalent system of what we would call today international relations. They were constantly jockeying for power. They were constantly fighting against each other. They had these great festivals every few years. They had the most famous, of course, were the Olympic Games. And that meant that all the people came together from all the Greek city-states, from all over the Mediterranean. And for a few weeks, they stopped fighting and they slugged it out instead in athletic contests, the beginning of athletics and sport as we know them today. So you can actually see in the story of the ancient Greeks how athletics and sport grew out of warfare as a kind of stylized substitute for fighting it out on the battlefield. But sadly, the Greeks spent an awful lot of their time, wasted is tempting to say, actually slugging it out on the battlefield. It took them hundreds of years, and they were always sufficiently evenly matched that neither Athens nor Sparta nor any of the other city-states that tried to put their oar in ever really came out top dog for long. And in the end, they fought themselves to a standstill.
It is fascinating to me, and we of course are going to discuss Alexander in a second, but it is fascinating to me how they never really were empire interested, that they never tried to unify Greece or never tried to build themselves an empire like we are of course going to talk about Carthage and Rome in a few minutes, but that's fascinating that they never tried to unify their cities, and they didn't seem to be interested in that.
No, you're right. And I mean, by this time, this is a period when, the alphabet's been invented. Greeks are, they're writing their history, they're writing down their philosophical speculations, they're talking about themselves, but they're actually writing down the debates that they have. So we can follow those today. And from those debates, we can see it clearly how their thought developed. What really mattered to the Greeks of these small city-states was not so much exactly what you say, sort of unification or empire. It was the great buzzword for them was another Greek word we still have today, autonomia, autonomy.
Right.
It really mattered. They fought and they killed for the principle that no one outside the bounds of their own really quite small city-state could tell them what to do. And each city-state fought for the same principle. So it's if you like, it's a kind of centrifugal. It's kind of the opposite of empire building. Instead of coming together as empires often did and as nation states have done in more recent times, the Greek city-states kind of flew apart. And you see that even in the fact that they spent so much time getting on those ships and taking their chattels and their wives and their children to find a city somewhere else. It was kind of bursting apart, a bit like the early universe, I suppose.
Yeah, of course, going to talk about the Persian invasion soon, but before that, I want to talk about religion, and we mentioned it briefly. But when did the stories did they genuinely believe that the gods lived upon the same mount at Olympus? Is it? And something that fascinated me when I read Herodotus last summer was that they didn't seem to have the same gods like we think. Zeus, Ares and all those. I remember some of the names. I don't in right now all of them, but there's several different cities seem to worship different gods. Like Sparta seemed to worship Ares, or for example, it's probably not correct, but Athens, maybe, for example, Zeus. That they didn't have the same gods they worship like we think they might. If because I thought that until I read Herodotus myself, where it seemed like they probably worshipped all the gods. The same cities had the same, but that's not the case, is it?
Well, ancient Greek religion is very different from any of the monotheistic religions that we know today. I mean, it's completely different from either Christianity or Islam. There was no real system of belief, and indeed, it didn't really matter so much what people believed. Rather, there was a whole series of stories about a whole series of gods and goddesses, and people just added these stories one on top of another. If wherever you lived, you would build a temple in honor of the god that took your imagination or that had some sort of mythical connection with your city. Often, the Athenians liked to believe that their city had been founded by the goddess Athena, who has more or less the same name. Um, but they weren't even very sure about that. There was another god, Poseidon, the god of the sea, who apparently, and they liked to think that Poseidon and Athena had actually competed, which was going to be top god for Athens. They were quite fanciful stories, and there was no kind of control over these stories. There were lots of there were priests, there were rituals, but this was handed down by word of mouth from generation to generation. It wasn't sort of regulated. There was no supreme religious authority, and as I say, nobody terribly minded what you believed, so long as in each city you took part in the communal festivals. They were great on the idea of animal sacrifice. They were constantly killing large numbers of animals.
Was human sacrifice involved as well in the beginning, or was that never the case in ancient Greece?
Oh, well, that's one of these fascinating stories. There are lots of stories in Greek mythology about human sacrifice. It never seems to have happened in historical times, but there are lots of indications that it did happen in prehistoric times. And actually, there is archaeological evidence now from Crete that during the Bronze Age, human sacrifice was practiced by the Minoans of Crete, who spoke a different language from the Greeks, but they were obviously very much involved in the birth of Greek civilization. But no, in the classical times, the great sort of communal activity was animal sacrifice. You kill these animals, you butcher them, you basically in the open air in front of the temple of the gods, you've got a slaughterhouse, your butcher's shop, and finally, what it all culminates in a gigantic civic barbecue. And the theory was that the gods conveniently really liked the smoke that went up from the barbecue, and the mortal humans got to eat the good bits of the animals they'd killed. So there was a certain amount of pragmatism in these religious practices as well.
So let's talk about of course, the big. This is arguably the big villain in quote unquote Persia and then Persian invasion of Greece. Is that because it does seem that it kind of did unify Sparta and Greece. They did kind of unify at the time to fight against Persia when they came to invade it. I mean, of course, I want to begin before we go to the Battle of Marathon with the infamous Leonidas and the infamous 300. So let's talk about the Persian invasion and how Persia became kind of the big villain, if you will, in antiquity.
Well, I mean, you've got these Greeks who are scattered in little settlements all around the Mediterranean, and then, as I say, when they started out, there was no one really on these shores to prevent them doing that. But as time went on, far further to the east, in today's Middle East, an enormous empire was coming together under the rule of the Iranian-speaking kings known as the Achaemenid dynasty. And during the 6th century BCE, these gathered together really the whole of the Middle East. They conquered Egypt, they conquered today's Turkey, and it seems to have been, in world history, it's one of the biggest, it was perhaps the biggest empire the world had known up to that time. And shortly after the year 500, the Persian great king, the king of kings, began to set his sights across the Mediterranean towards Europe. And the first people you got to, if you crossed into Europe from Asia, were the Greeks. So you've got this classic sort of David and Goliath confrontation. On the one side, a unified, mighty, militarized, monarchical empire. On the other, the scattered, sort of self-defining, self-inventing Greeks who've got no kind of military power, concentrated military power, or kind of supranational organization at all. And yet, against all expectation, when they were invaded, some of the Greek city-states, not all of them, some of them did finally overcome their differences among each other. They fought against the common enemy, and during 2 wars fought in 490 and in 480 to 479 BCE, the Greeks won. They saw off the Persian invader.
Which of course brings us next, because although they did unify, and we are kind of skipping a few centuries ahead, but we've got 1500 years to go through, so do forgive me here. But so we kind of have to skip ahead a bit, and we can't cover everything. And if you want to read more about ancient Greece, you should absolutely read this book. If this episode is intriguing enough to do further research on this, but we have to talk about, even though they did unify for a brief second there, they did eventually have more or less a civil war, which I'm of course referring to the famous Peloponnesian War. And this is where we get one of the, though Herodotus is first, is kind of more or less first account of war, and you should absolutely read Thucydides' work as well. And he's one of the utmost historians on the topic, because he was a general in the war himself. Though he died before he did finish his book, but still, how essential is this book in understanding? I guess my question is the Peloponnesian War, and let's talk. And how if you read the Peloponnesian War, how reliable is it?
Well, I mean, there are the 2 great Greek historians of the 5th century BCE, and between them, they literally invented history, both as a way of telling a story and as a way of making sense of the past. Nothing like it had been done before. The first you mentioned was Herodotus, and it's because it's through Herodotus' histories written not long after the end of the Persian Wars that we know all about the Persian Wars, and therefore we know of what the Greeks did. And really, it's the fact, in a way, it's the fact of making a monumental history book out of these events that really fixed them in the mind of every generation since. So history really begins with the writing down of the story of the Persian Wars by Herodotus. A generation, maybe 2 generations after Herodotus, comes Thucydides. And as you say, Thucydides took part himself. He's an Athenian. He took part in the war that lasted for 27 years against Sparta. We know that he lived long enough to see the war through to its end, but we don't know when he died, but he left his work unfinished. he didn't actually bring it up to the end of the story. But Thucydides is a far more meticulous, in many ways, a much more modern historian than Herodotus. Herodotus is a great storyteller. He's a character. He presents himself in his pages. He enjoys all stories.
I really did enjoy the story where he says to these two kids that I think it was they were gonna raise a goat or something, and then they were done, or they were who were speaking first, and then there's these two kids that apparently one was more intelligent than the other. I don't remember that. It's a while ago since I read Herodotus, but that was one of the most amusing stories from I
Well,
find.
yeah, I mean, he gathered. I mean, in many he was. I mean, he was the first historian, but he was also the first journalist. I mean, he seems to have traveled all over the known world of his time. He interviewed lots of people. He must have kept notes, and he had an eye for a good story, and he kept them and he told them. Sometimes, some of the stories he tells are outrageous and obviously not true, and sometimes he kind of visibly winks in the text and says, "Well, I'm not sure whether to believe this or not, but make up your own mind."
Right.
The other thing he does that a lot of later historians did too was he made up long speeches that he put into the mouths of the characters in the stories. And I mean, these can't be, there was no recording in those days. Nobody could know what King Xerxes said on the eve of a battle. But Herodotus has several pages of what the of the speeches, and this really, it dramatizes history. And Thucydides actually did that too. It may be that some of his speeches are based on notes of real speeches, because Thucydides, that's what I was going on to say, Thucydides was much more of a sort of meticulous, careful, cautious historian. He checked his sources. He's much more reticent about putting himself in his narrative. He's very conscious of historical method, and reading between the lines, he's clearly, he's a bit got it in for Herodotus, and he wants to make his own mark on history. And in many, professional historians probably owe more or even more to Thucydides than they do to Herodotus. But between them, these two really invented the genre of history, and that way of, well, if history is a science, they created that too.
So of course we had to move on as well, and next up is of course Philip. I want to begin before going to Alexander, Philip of Macedon, because he is almost essential in as well to talk about before in understanding Alexander. And so let's talk about Philip II of Macedon before we go into Alexander for a bit.
Okay. Well, okay. I mean, well, let's start with Macedonia to begin with, because the Greek world was, there was no place called Greece that was actually marked out on the map. As I was saying, there were all these different city-states, and all the people spoke Greek, and they fought for their autonomy from one another. But they didn't all organize themselves in that way. And the Greeks on the northern edge of that world, in today's southern Balkans and northern Greece, didn't actually form a city-state at all. They kept a more traditional hereditary kind of kingdom. It was quite primitive, it was quite rough. The Greeks in the cities like Athens and Sparta terribly looked down their noses on these semi-barbarous Greeks of Macedonia. They did one of the worst things they did was they drank wine neat without putting water in it. Well, just imagine. But they also got absolutely raving drunk and behaved extremely badly. So the Greeks,
they were frowned upon more or less.
They were very much frowned upon. They were on the edge between Greeks and, in inverted commas, barbarians. But they were powerful. And Philip II really got it together. He pulled together this rather shapeless kingdom of Macedonia, and he turned it into a military superpower. And the superpower that he created in just a couple of decades was more than a match for any Greek city-state, or even an alliance of several of them. So in the year 338 BCE, Philip brought his Macedonian army south into Greece. He defeated a rare alliance of the Athenians and their rivals, the Thebans at the Battle of Chaeronea, or Chironia, it's pronounced in different ways. That's in 338 BCE. And from that time, Philip really became the master of all the Greek-speaking world. And Philip conceived the idea, partly, I think, in order to draw together the city-states that he'd conquered, to reconcile them perhaps to his takeover. He conceived this idea that what he was going to do next was he was going to take the war out of Europe into Asia and actually make war on the Persians who had previously invaded Greece. And Philip he planned this expedition, and he, in effect, conscripted all the Greek city-states to send troops to aid this expedition. And he presented it as a kind of revenge match for the Persian wars of a century and a half before. But
is this when he gets shot in the eye, or blinded in the one eye? Because there is this one battle where I don't remember which one it is, but there is in Adrian Goldsworth's book on Philip and Alexander, he does mention that he got blinded. I don't remember where, but he does get shot with an arrow in one eye and he get blinded.
Yeah, I don't think we know what caused the wound, whether it was an arrow or a sword, but it was certainly he lost the sight of one eye. That was quite early in his career. He also had a wound in his leg, apparently, which gave him a limp, and those were and those physical traces were found on the in the tomb that was unearthed in 1978, which is believed to be the tomb of Philip II. But no, so this happened. Those injuries happened to him earlier, but it was after he'd announced he was going to make this new war against Persia. He'd sent off the advance guard, and he had a great ceremony in his capital city, and he had a Greek-style theatre, a semicircular theatre with an auditorium, and there must have been about 10,000 spectators there. Being Macedonians, they'd all been drinking heavily the night before, but at dawn on the day, the king led his retinue in front of all these spectators, and they were going to put on a show, a spectacle, to impress everybody during the day. And to begin with, he started by wheeling on or carrying on statues of the 12 gods, and then there's a 13th statue, which was Philip II. Philip II himself was the king becoming a god. And minutes afterwards, somebody ran up to him and stabbed him in the chest in front of 10,000 people.
It was rumored that Alexander was part of this assassination, wasn't there?
Well, indeed, there were rumors at the time. There have been rumors ever since, and I mean, I discuss this in my book. I won't tell you what conclusion I come to, but Alexander is certainly lined up there with the suspects, because it was a lackey who was hired to carry out the killing, and he himself was killed very shortly afterwards. So there was no evidence. It was an astonishingly stage-managed murder in broad daylight, in public view. But the upshot of that murder was that the 18-year-old Alexander became the next king of the Macedonians. And this, of course, is the Alexander we know as, in inverted commas, the Great.
If I remember correctly, it wasn't supposed to be him that was taken over. It didn't have other brothers that was as well candidates to take over the throne, wasn't there?
Yeah, Alexander killed a few other people just to make sure that no one else had to go at the throne. Let's be honest. I mean, Alexander is a phenomenon in world history.
Not a very kind person.
I don't warm to him as a person at all.
But yeah, that's of course this brings us to Alexander the Great, and there is this famous story that he was kind of resenting his father because every territory that Philip II conquered was a less territory that he could not conquer himself. There is this famous, as far if I remember correctly, that he was kind of angry at his father for this.
Yes, and there was a famous quarrel with his father, and he threw a drinking cup or a sword at him or something. And I mean, again, the Macedonian court was like that. I mean, it's true. We only have the Greeks' word for it from the Athenians' word for it, and they didn't like the Macedonians, but they do come over as pretty a pretty rough bunch of people. I think we have to believe these stories. No, Alexander seems to have set out with the determination to conquer, and he did. I mean, he only lived to the age of 33, so just short of 33. He won. He fought in a whole series of battles, four massive ones against the Persians and Indians. He never lost a battle, and he created the first ever Greek empire, which spanned the whole of basically what we now call the Middle East, and right into northern Pakistan and northern India, as well as the southern Balkans and Greece.
I'm sure you have your grievances about this movie, but what did you think about Ridley Scott's Alexander movie?
I loved it, actually. It was very enjoyable. Yeah, and also, I mean, it was very well historically based. It had the great historian Robin Lane Fox as a consultant, and I believe Robin was actually allowed to act a part as an extra in the film. I mean, he's written one of the best books about Alexander the Great. It's a hugely enjoyable film, but I mean, I wasn't looking to pick historical holes in it, but I think it was, it was kind of believable.
And in the movie, at least, it does seem that he's fairly close to his mother. Was this the case in real life as well? Was he fairly close with his mother? That really, but for the lack of better word, tight relationship.
Well, I mean, how long did that relationship last? Because they never saw each other after he was 18 and went off to Persia. But and his mother was the fourth of Philip's 7 wives, and she clearly had taken a dislike to Philip in a big way. He was clearly closer to her than to his father. But you could kind of the various kind of Freudian speculations. I think it is speculation. We just we don't know enough about Olympias, his mother. But it's a fact. These are fascinating characters.
So let's talk about his conquest before we move on, because we have to, of course, talk about it's legendary that his conquest. So it goes all the way to India, and like you said, and it is this infamous story about the Indian princess who. I don't remember exactly how it goes, but I think he kind of pawns her. If I remember correctly, there is this famous story about the Indian princess and Alexander when he gets to India.
There is, and I'm not sure whether that's one of the true stories, or I mean, there was quite a lot of fake news. There was a kind of there were a whole sort of there's what's called the Alexander romance, which was a set of stories that circulated for hundreds of years after his death, and they had ever more wild and wonderful adventures in them. There's a princess. There's various monsters. There are anthropophagi. There are priests. You can't believe it all.
Yeah, but of course he does almost conquer India, and they have elephants, which kind of stops him. War elephants, but he wanted to conquer, but his army, of course, is resistant, and they don't want to go home. They have families, they have land to take care of, and in famously dies on the journey home. He never makes it, and he never points out a successor either. Does he? So it is the empire is kind of cruel. And again, there is of course a legend about his death where he says, "Isn't that the one?" You know this better than I do. So what is the legend that he claims how he chooses his successor?
Well, I mean, he didn't choose a successor, but I mean, he was on his deathbed. He was only 32. Nobody expected him to die, least of all himself. He clearly hadn't thought about the succession. There's something, and I forget the exact words. There's something he's supposed to have said that possibly identified one of the generals who was around his deathbed as the successor. but the others refused to believe it anyway, and there was no very good authority. So the whole thing fell apart after his death. His top generals fell out among themselves. They basically fought for 30 years to divide up the spoils, and instead of bequeathing therefore one big empire as like the Persian Empire had been, Alexander's conquests were followed by not one but three large kingdoms: one in Asia, one in Africa based in Egypt, and one in Europe based in Macedonia. And these kind of jockeyed for position for the next 300 years,
Right.
until they were all slowly swallowed up by the new emerging power in the Mediterranean, which was that of Rome.
Mm. Before we go on, there is at the end this legend. We can't know if it's true or not, but I don't think yet, I'm sure. But Caesar, there is the story of Caesar where he cries in front of a statue, I think, of Alexander when he is 23 years old, I think, where he is so disappointed because he hasn't conquered nearly enough territory as Alexander by his age. And he's crying because he's so disappointed. I feel like he failed his hero.
No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, these stories almost certainly are true. It's fascinating, actually, that the Roman emperors, once there were Roman emperors, and the Roman generals, including Caesar, who competed with one another in effect to become emperors, though they never did, they all were obsessed with Alexander the Great. And in fact, I mean, I believe it's I don't think it is, you don't really read this so much in history books, but I believe that the way the Roman emperor, the role of the Roman emperor was constructed later was really a deliberate continuation of the kind of kingship that was first set up by Alexander and then carried on by his immediate successors.
No, I
So
want to ask about this. I'm sorry if I interrupt you there, but
no,
I want to ask you because, as you know, under this justice right now, the Romans loved Alexander, and as you said, the Greeks, they viewed the Macedonians as barbarians. But how did they view Alexander after his death and his legendary conquest? How did that change the Greeks' view of Macedonians? So were they more feared after this, or were they awed on Alexander?
well, one of the things about Greeks in ancient times, perhaps also in modern, is they could never agree among themselves. So, I mean, some Greeks fought with Alexander, followed his armies all the way. They must have admired what he was doing. Certainly later Greek historians hugely admired him and wrote admiring histories of what he had done. But, others frankly hated him. And the the great Athenian statesman Demosthenes, led the cheers in the theatre in Athens on the day that news came that Alexander had died. They thought that Alexander had died. They were going to be liberated from the Macedonians. There was no love lost. So, but obviously, as time went on and Greeks began to see how their language, their culture had become, spread so widely through the world, they became more to terms with what had happened. So, as I say, by the time the histories that we read about Alexander today came to be written, which was in the time of the Roman Empire, the Greek historians are pretty much cheerleaders for Alexander, but even they, I mean, they don't conceal all the all the bad things that he did. They're capable of, they're critical of things that they report, and they don't cover them up.
So, something that you forgot to mention was that one of the reasons that did die so young was that he was struggling with alcohol as well. He was more or less an alcoholic, wasn't he?
Again, I mean, it seems so. I mean, and again, I'm not sure that so much a personal trait. The evidence suggests that actually, the Macedonian kings were expected to be alcoholics. They were certainly, I mean, not alcoholics in our terms, but part of the kind of machismo of the ruling class in Macedonia was they had to be able to drink vast quantities, but also not show it. So it's not so much alcoholism in the clinical sense, perhaps, as a kind of ostentatious behavior, but of course it would have had a medical effect. And I mean, some say it was, he drank himself to death. Others that he was poisoned. I don't know. I mean, I just,
And we should probably mention as well, so again, sorry for interrupting you, but we should mention that alcohol wasn't as strong back then as it is today, was it? So it's different perspective what you consider alcoholism back in those days than versus now. That alcohol, if you had to mix it with water to make good, like the wine, it's not as strong as today's alcohol, right?
That's right. I mean, I don't think the sort of whiskies and brandy, or the raki that you drink in those parts of the world today. I don't think these were around.
So of course you mentioned Rome, and I wanted to conclude Alexander's story first, but like you said, the growing power of Rome eventually united Italy, and of course you have to mention there's another power we mentioned briefly, which is Carthage, and they became a massive trading partner too. And eventually Rome and Carthage went head on head, which is the famous Punic Wars. And how did the Punic Wars affect the Greek community? Did it have an effect at all on the Greek world?
They did, and the reason was because the Punic Wars, as you say, it was Rome against Carthage. It was north versus south, Rome in Italy, Carthage almost due south in today's Tunisia. And it was so the war between continents, it was a war between city-states. But it also became a kind of world war because they spread, it spread by land and by sea right round the Mediterranean. The Carthaginian general Hannibal famously led his army with elephants all the way through Spain, southern France, across the Alps in winter, and down into Italy, where he very nearly took Rome. And if that had happened, the whole story of the Roman Empire would never have happened either.
We made an episode about alternative history where we discussed this. What would the world look like today? What language would we speak in? Would Carthage have been this version of Rome if they had won the Punic War? Would this be some form of Carthaginian instead of the Romans languages like Spain? And how would it would look vastly different? It's arguably if the Carthaginians had won over Rome in the Punic Wars.
It surely would. But the Greek communities, because they were spread right throughout that whole region, the Greek communities find themselves having to take sides in that war. And that, it's quite complicated, but the upshot was that some of the Macedonians took the side of the Carthaginians. And so when Rome had finished with Carthage, they moved east and had a go at the Macedonians and some of the Greek city-states. And that slowly snowballed. Rome had disposed of its biggest rival in Carthage, and there was nothing really to stop the Romans expanding outwards in all directions. And unlike the Greeks, the Romans did have a sense of empire. They wanted to control other peoples, and they did devise systems for doing it, so that Rome really succeeded Persia as being a highly organized, centralized empire that lasted for a good 500 years, depending.
I don't know. And of course, we're going to discuss this in the next episode as well, but it did last all the way until 1453, if you count the Byzantines as the Roman Empire.
Yeah, you could say a millennium and a half. You could. So that the Greeks, by the middle of the 2nd century BC, had really been taken into the Roman orbit, and they became hugely embroiled in the Roman civil wars. The wars between, we mentioned Julius Caesar already. Caesar fought a bitter civil war against his rival general Pompey the Great. in the middle of the 1st century BC, and most of that fighting actually happened in the region of today's Greece. So again, Greeks are involved in that too.
So, someone we haven't mentioned though, and is a lovely chap, and I want to go a little bit back in time right before Caesar, and he was outlawed by, I believe Caesar was outlawed by him as well, and I believe you know who I'm talking about. Is of course the ruthless sack of Athens by the dictator Sulla, who.
Yes, indeed, that was part of a very complicated set of wars that Rome was fighting in the Eastern Mediterranean. But at the same time, Rome was torn apart by civil strife. And a generation before Caesar and Pompey, the rival generals that I mentioned, was a very similar rivalry between Marius and Sulla. And each of these generals, in his turn, actually led an army into Rome and imposed his will on the Roman people. And Sulla infamously became dictator of Rome for 2 years.
But he did retire actually, unlike Caesar. He did, if I remember
Yes,
correctly, he
you're
retired.
right. Absolutely right. Sulla, well, it's a long story. I mean, the role of dictator in the Roman Republic was you were only allowed to become dictator for 6 months max, and then you went away again. It was an emergency.
Imagine Stalin being dictator for 6 months.
Well, quite, yeah. It was an emergency measure, and Sulla broke the rules because he hung on to it for 2 years. But even Sulla, at the end of 2 years, did retire to his estates, and he did actually die in his bed. Move it on a generation. Caesar got himself or proclaimed himself dictator for life, and 2 months later he was murdered in the Senate because dictator for life, the senators thought, was too much like being a king or an emperor, and the Romans really hated that idea.
Yeah. I mean, they would get an emperor eventually with Augustus, of course, but that wasn't Rex. That was something else, but it wasn't king.
That's right. The Roman emperors were called by a variety of titles, and the word that actually gives us the English and in other languages, the word emperor, imperator, originally just meant the commander of an army. It was a general, and the emperor they took other titles, but the first emperor, whose actual name was Octavian or Octavianus, in 27 BCE, invented the title Augustus, which in English we pronounce as Augustus, and
we had a famous month, of course, after him as well.
The
famous month in the year, August.
Of course, yes, indeed.
After, yeah.
August is named after him, as July is named after his adoptive father, Julius Caesar. So the Roman emperors put their marks on the names of the month that we still have today, but Augustus invented a number of titles for himself. The name by which he's known today actually was a title; it wasn't his name, but he carefully avoided the Latin word rex. And right throughout the later history of the Roman emperor, in Latin, no emperor was ever called rex. The Romans, they really hated the idea of. I mean, they had a monarchy and they bowed down to it, they accepted it, but they would never use the word. On the other hand, half the subjects of the Roman Empire spoke Greek. The whole eastern half, from the Adriatic to the Euphrates, everybody spoke and learned and wrote in Greek. And in Greek, it was normal to call the Roman emperor Basileus, which was the Greek word for a king that had been used by Alexander and the kings who came after it, which again...
And I believe that this will be later the Byzantine emperors.
And exactly, once well. Latin, that's right. Once as we go forward in time, once the Roman Empire collapsed in the West and the Eastern Greek-speaking empire became, in effect, autonomous, with a new capital in Constantinople, then Greek actually became the official language, and the emperors were called, we call them emperors, but in their own language, the title was actually the old one, meaning king, basileus.
Of course, someone essential, and that's a little fellow. We don't move to Jerusalem right now. And you write about him as well. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about. That's a little fellow called Jesus Christ, who is essential. And what was surprising to me, because I didn't know this until I covered him a while ago, actually, on the podcast as well, is that in the beginning, in early Hebrew was in Greek, but the Jews in the beginning, as you write about it in your book, they kind of resented Greek, and this kind of resented this. They were hesitant in learning Greek, and they were like preferred sticking themselves to the Hebrew language, didn't they? So let's talk about this little fella called Jesus Christ, who would eventually start out the religion that we know today as Christianity.
Indeed. Well, I mean, so far as we know, the historical person who was Jesus was lived in a province of what was a part of the Roman province of Judea, and his native language, almost certainly, the common language he spoke, was not Hebrew but Aramaic.
Right.
It's a Semitic language of the region that was very widely spoken. Hebrew was the official language of the ancient Jewish religion, but I believe it. I'm not an expert in this, but I believe the common language spoken by Jesus and his disciples would have been Aramaic. It was after his death when his disciples wanted to spread what they called the gospel, the good news that Jesus had brought to earth. They wanted to spread that and make converts beyond their own community, which spoke Aramaic and worshipped in Hebrew. And the common language in the eastern part of the empire, that the one language you could rely on, that everybody could read, or everybody who could read would read that language, and everybody who couldn't read would probably speak some of it. That language was Greek. And it was clearly...
what I wanted to, and sorry if I interrupted you a few times now, but like I wanted to say when we spoke about like Greek being the main language in certain areas, that's kind of like English there, right? Like
it was absolutely,
I'm Norwegian, so
like
and I don't know English as my second language and Spanish as my third language. But in every respectable Roman aristocrat as well, they learn Greek, and there's several. And to mention one, for example, is the famous General Germanicus. He wrote several dramas and comedies in Greek, and several other aristocrats as well wrote. So Greek was kind of like English today, especially in the Roman world, where most aristocrats and rich Roman, that was a mandatory language to learn if you were to be respectable in those circles.
It absolutely was, but I mean, there are two things going on here, because the first thing is that the Roman elite it changed a bit later, but during the time of Julius Caesar and Cicero and Augustus, the Roman elite had really been, their education was deeply based in Greek education, and exactly as you say, if you were really smart, really educated, you had to speak Greek. There's a much quoted moment in Shakespeare's historical play Julius Caesar, where the orator and philosopher Cicero is reported as speaking, and the character says, Cicero spoke, and someone, well, what did he say? Well, he spoke Greek. And I said, what did he say? Well, 'twas Greek to me, the character says in Shakespeare's play, and that's become a kind of byword. People don't, ordinary people don't understand Greek, but educated Romans did. But the other thing that was going on at the same time, and continued actually much longer, was that in the parts of the Roman Empire that previously had been Greek speaking, Greek remained the language of education and commerce and just everyday communication. So, as I was saying, everywhere east of the toe of Italy and the Adriatic, as far as the Euphrates and Tigris, or even the Red Sea, the Arabian Gulf, the common language there is Greek. So when the followers of Jesus began to spread his teaching, they clearly made a conscious decision to do that in the everyday spoken language. And I mean, this is fascinating because the language in which the letters of the Apostle Paul, which are the very first surviving Christian texts, and the Gospels that were written a little bit later, tell the story of Jesus' life and teaching, all of these were written in a form of Greek, not at all the Greek of the educated, the Greek of that someone like Cicero would learn, but the Greek of every day, the Greek of of daily letter writing, of commerce, and in that way, we have both. It's very living, it's very living, it's very hands-on kind of language, but also, among other things, in addition to the religious content, the Gospels and the earliest Christian writings give us a window into the form of Greek that was actually spoken by ordinary people at that time. And it is, given how long ago that was, it is surprisingly close to the Greek that we still speak today.
So if I was to learn modern Greek, which I know is way too complicated for me, but if hypothetically, if I didn't know Greek and I went back in time to, let's say, the time of Jesus, would I understand the Greek spoken in the street to them?
I think you'd have a much better chance than if you went back another 500 years to the time of Plato, or 400 to the time of Plato, or 500 or 600 to the time of Herodotus. And if you go back to the time of Homer, maybe 700 or 800 years before Jesus, you don't stand a chance. The Greek language actually changed more between the time of Homer and the time of Jesus than it has between the time of Jesus and today. And I'm sure that's because it's been written, that we have the written record. So there's always been the written text that people go back to, kind of, if you like, putting a kind of brake on the process whereby languages constantly change and develop.
Of course, it wasn't easy being a Christian in the early days of Christianity, and they were people, the Romans, they were easy. It was easy to put them as a scapegoat, to so to speak. And Nero, in the fire of Rome, he immediately thought that, hey, these fellas might be the reason for this. It's kind of like what Jews later would become for Christians, right? That they were the first 300 years. We will get to Constantine in a few minutes, but the first 300 years of Christianity was not really a fun time to be a Christian. But they were left alone, of course, but mostly because the Romans were more kind of tolerant as long as they didn't step out of line with your religion. But that was easy to. Why was it so easy to scapegoat Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one because the story that became part of the Christian tradition afterwards plays a lot of emphasis on persecution. I mean, Jesus, the historical Jesus, was after all executed as a seditious criminal by the Roman authorities in Jerusalem.
And again, I'm sorry for interrupting you again, but we spoke about this in our episode about Jesus as well. That and I want to mention this as this. I'm so sorry for interrupting you again, but in the Bible, right? Pilatus that's the Roman emperor, Roman general. Pilate. Yeah, he's more or less portrayed as weak in the Bible because he's given the option of freeing either Jesus or this other guy who's also a renowned criminal, even worse. He's actually a criminal, unlike Jesus, but in reality, he was just doing his job. He was just doing what he was set out to do. So he wasn't really weak at all. It was just, though he was kind of insignificant at the time, he was just doing his job. That's what he did.
Sure, but I mean, there's the central episode of the whole Christian story is the crucifixion, and so, and from that developed also the idea of martyrdom. So some of the followers of Jesus during the following centuries were put to death, sometimes in gratuitously horrific ways, by the Roman authorities on the grounds of their faith. When you detach the sort of the Christian martyr stories, when you detach those from what we know of the history of the period, you actually get a rather different picture. I mean, it's not that these horrific events didn't take place, they did, and clearly some Christians were sufficiently committed to their religion to endure unspeakable tortures and terrible deaths in order to uphold their beliefs. There's no doubt about that. But it was a very small minority of individuals who were caught up in that whole process. The great majority of Christians, even in those times, neither had to nor presumably felt any great need to become martyrs. I mean, you mentioned the Emperor Nero, who, it's true, in a gratuitous episode in 64 CE or AD, scapegoated the Christians after Rome was burnt down in a fire. This is when the Emperor Nero was himself accused of famously fiddling while Rome burned. He had to put the blame on
Which is, of
somebody
course,
else.
ludicrous.
Of course, it's ludicrous. So he put the blame on somebody else, and according to the Roman historian Tacitus, the Christian community was scapegoated, and many of them were put to death. But apart from that, there was no systematic persecution until the 3rd century. So we're more than 200 years after the death of Jesus.
And the lovely 3rd century.
In the 3rd century, it's that time when the Roman Empire is going through a bad patch. There's a lot of civil war going on. Emperors are constantly deposing one another. And they're also, for the first time, really having to fight rather hard to defend Rome's frontiers against the outsiders, whom they called barbarians. And ironically enough, it was 2 emperors in the middle of the 3rd century who, one after the other, at 10-year intervals, decided that they really had to make an example of Christians in order to restore the goodwill of the gods to Rome. Rome was being under pressure on the frontiers. The emperor was about to lead an army to try to push back the barbarians, and they issued edicts that everybody must make sacrifices according to the ancient religion, and if they didn't, they would be put to death. Now, the 2 emperors who did this, one of them was Decius, who 2 years after his edict was killed himself fighting against the barbarians near the Danube River. The second, 10 years later, the Emperor Valerian did the same thing, and he led an army against the Persians. He was captured by the Persians, and he died in captivity. So again, the idea of persecuting Christians didn't get a very good press right from the beginning. It may have been motivated by a kind of old-fashioned appeal to the old gods, but if that was the motivation, it didn't work very well. But there were these 2 periods of persecution, and then for some reason, we don't really know why, at the end of the 3rd century, the Roman Emperor Diocletian, who was the one who really pulled things together after a period of 50 years that were pretty chaotic, he decided at the very end of his reign, in the year 303, so into the 4th century now, he decided that Christians really were a bad thing and had to be uprooted.
He loved his cabbages, didn't he?
He loved
his cabbages.
Well, he went off to farm them in his. I mean, he was the only Roman emperor, I think, who ever retired, and he went off to his rather fabulous palace that he'd built in the today in the Croatian town of Split, and you can still see the palace. But he decided to persecute Christians, and a byproduct of that slightly underexplained policy was that during the 30 years that followed, 20 years that followed, suddenly, whether to persecute Christians or to support them became a burning political issue in the Roman Empire. It didn't have to be like that. They were still talking about, a very small minority, at the most 10%, in some parts of the empire, probably well below that. But whether you were for or against this small minority really, really mattered. I mean, dare I say, and I probably daren't, but it's possibly a little bit like the whole argument about, you can't go into debate about the position of trans people today. Very few people actually are trans, but there are huge body of opinion that believes passionately and cares passionately about the treatment of people in that situation. I think
J.J.
it must
Rowling
have
is
been.
one of them, isn't she?
It was like, yeah, quite. That's why, dare I say this, but I think with early Christians, it was somewhat comparable. It was a small group of people, but suddenly, and for not very clear reasons, the fate of these people and one's attitude to these people became a burning political issue. So, as after Diocletian first retired and then died, his successors fought among themselves.
Yeah, we forgot to mention that the Tetrarchy, I believe, is
That's
called.
right. The Tetrarchy
Yeah,
meant there were 4 emperors at the throne at the same time.
that was certainly worked out well.
It worked out well. So the new Tetrarchy, after Diocletian resigned in 306, there were 4 emperors, and they basically fought for 20 years to eliminate one another. And the one who came out on top was the man called Constantine. He defeated one co-emperor, after having seen a vision in the sky in which he saw the Christian cross, and he believed that the God of the Christians was on his side.
Of course, this is the Battle of Milvian Bridge.
The famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Constantine, therefore, decided he became a patron of Christianity. He supported Christians. He built churches. And during the final round, which lasted for another 10 years, with his last co-emperor, a man called Licinius. Licinius was following the old policy of persecuting Christians. Therefore, Constantine made it his policy to support Christians. So when Constantine won, he defeated his last enemy in the year 324. Constantine came out as top dog. He's the one undisputed emperor of the entire Roman Empire, but he's done it on the back of defeating someone who persecuted Christians. Therefore, whether he meant it or not, I think, well, this must be a poor guy. Is he a committed Christian who always wanted to do this? Or is he suddenly find he's landed with a debt that he's got to repay? We simply don't know. But
in the episode about Byzantine Empire, I've done several episodes on the Byzantines, but one of the earliest one we mentioned, it was mainly purely propaganda that Constantine converted. That it wasn't really moral reasons. It was mainly propaganda that he converted. That he realized that this could be a tool. There seemed to be enough potential here that I could use. That's his way of thinking, more or less, that this could be a tool I can use to gain popularity in my kingdom.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen your podcast. I'd be interested to see, how you handle that. It is a fascinating question. I mean, the truth is, we simply don't know. Lots of historians have tried to psychologize Constantine, to explain in more or less sort of, I mean, it's a whole spectrum from the deeply religious. His first biographer was a Christian bishop who saw it all in, very clearly religious terms, and there's a school of thought right to this day. I mean, Constantine is venerated as a saint in the Orthodox Christian Church. Many more, both at the time and up to today, many historians have taken a more cynical or a more calculating view, and somewhere on that spectrum, the truth must lie. It may also be that there isn't a single truth. There may have been an interplay between some degree between political calculation and religious faith. Constantine, I mean, again, a bit like Alexander the Great. I mean, he doesn't come over to me, frankly, as a very sympathetic character.
Right. I mean, didn't he kill his own son or boy, his mother, or something?
He gave orders for his own son and one of his wives to be killed on clearly seemingly rather spurious grounds. He also, I mean, he put up a famous statue of himself, much larger than life.
Yeah.
Only the head and the toes survive. You can't judge much from the toes, but the head. I mean, there's a picture.
I mean, people with feet fetish can, but
Well, yeah, but I mean, the picture of the head is in my book. It's in many other books. You can see it all over the internet. He doesn't look very amiable to me, I must say.
I mean,
But
this again. Before we move on, I want to ask. This is one of again. This is one of the one big what if questions. And I know historians kind of hate alternative history, but it's fun to speculate. I think if Constantine had lost the Battle of Middleville Bridge, do you think that Christianity has been inevitable more in a way that it would have eventually just later in the centuries emerged as this main belief in the Roman Empire, and as of course Gibbon famously says that Christianity is the process of decline of the Roman Empire. But do you think that if he had lost, that Christianity would have become sooner or later the main religion of the empire?
Possibly not, you know. It's very hard to tell. I mean, that's one of the that's part of the question about Constantine himself. I mean, because we just can't know what it was like what it felt like to be alive at that time. I mean, maybe even although this was quite a small group of people, maybe, you know, it really was catching, it was, you know, it was increasing. Maybe there was a kind of impetus coming up from below. Sooner or later, you were going to have to become Christian, so go with it. Kind of catch the tide. Maybe that's what Constantine was doing. Or maybe it was still a fringe movement that might still have gone nowhere. I think if he'd lost the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, it's perhaps more likely it would have gone nowhere. By the time he fought the second battle, 12 years later in 324, and defeated Licinius across the strait from Constantinople, if he'd lost that battle, you know, if Licinius had won and Licinius was persecuting Christians, maybe, you know, would that still have put it back? It's hard to tell. Or perhaps
it's one of the defined moments in history, isn't it? That Constantine.
It is. I think it's during, you know, it's during the reign of Constantine, from when he first he becomes one of the Tetrarchy in 306. And at that time, Christians are officially being persecuted throughout the empire until 324, when he defeats his last rival, who's an anti-Christian, and he becomes, you know, he becomes the official supporter of Christianity. You know, that's the pivotal period of those 18 years, when, you know, the weight, you know, the scales change from Christianity being an outlier to being the mainstream. It's not true, by the way. It's often said that Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. That actually took another 100 years to happen, and it was done gradually. But what he did do was, and he began the process, he began the legislation, he began the building of churches, the grants to Christian organizations.
Of course, the famous basilica type church.
Well, I mean, the basilica was simply a Roman building, and it became a church in the time of Constantine. I mean, Constantine was the first person to declare Sunday a holiday, for example. So, you know, there were institutionally, Christianity was moving into it became, if you like, it became mainstream in the Roman Empire in the last years of Constantine's reign. But the change to the official and only religion of the empire took almost 200 years to carry out.
Right, and of course, what made this decision that Rome is not really a significant place to have the capital of the Roman Empire anymore? And let's move to what was then called Byzantium, the city of Byzantium, which eventually became Constantinople, of course. How did it find out this and end up here?
Well, I'm realizing this is turned into quite a long podcast. So perhaps this is the appropriate point at which to end. That what we haven't mentioned so far is the one brilliant thing that Constantine undoubtedly did,
right,
whatever you think of his religion or his politics, and that was to take a minor Greek city on the edge of the Bosphorus, it's called Byzantium, and rebuild it as an imperial capital, because that city really thereafter controlled the passage from Europe into Asia for the next 1,000 years, and indeed 1,500 years. It became one of the great world capitals. He called it after himself. He renamed it after himself, Constantine's city, Constantinopolis, or Constantinople. And that was the foundation. That really very quickly came to supersede Rome itself as the most important city of the Roman Empire.
And not only that, we discussed this in our episode about the fall of Constantinople 2 years ago as well, that Constantinople would eventually become one of the most important cities in world history as well.
It would, and to bring it back to the Greeks that we're talking about, although Constantine himself was a Roman and spoke Latin as his first language, it was a city in the Greek-speaking East, and before long, by the time it became an imperial capital, it would also be an imperial Greek-speaking capital. It would become the capital of a Greek-speaking empire, though it always called itself the Roman Empire.
And that is what we are going to discuss in the next episode, because as we mentioned in the start, this is a two-part series, because we're going to go through 3,000 years of history here, so we decided that we're going to do this in 2 parts. So if you like this episode, I hope you're looking forward to the next episode, which will be about the Byzantine Empire and then eventually the Ottoman Empire, and then, of course, from Ataturk until today. And this has been with that as well. Before you go, do you have anything you want to promote on the social media or anywhere people might find you if they have questions and where people might find your book? Should they be interested in buying your book? And of course, you should absolutely, like you said, read his book where he goes so much more in detail. I'm sure we only had the tip of the iceberg of what he writes about in the book. So where might people find your book if they are interested in reading it after listening to this episode? And anything else you want me to put in a link in the description?
Well, the book is published in Great Britain and throughout Europe by Faber. It's available in paperback, online, and in, I hope, all good bookshops. It's published in the USA by Basic Books, and the paperback, I think, will be coming out shortly. And it has been translated into a number of other languages as well. I'm sure you can find the book on the internet. And if you want to find me, I don't have social media accounts, but I'm sure you can find me too. And I'd like to, so thank you very much for giving me the time to talk about my book. I've very much enjoyed this part of our conversation and look forward to continuing it.
Me too. This has been That H12. We are available on Twitter under That H12, Instagram That H12. We are on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Please stay tuned for next week for part 2 of this podcast. I'm very much looking forward to recording that episode as well, because Byzantium is one of my favorite empires. I'm not going to lie to you. And if you are on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please consider writing a review if you like this episode. That would help us out a lot. If you're on YouTube, please subscribe. We are trying to get to 1,000 subscribers this year. That would be brilliant if we did manage to get there. My name is Erlend. This has been That H12, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.